Hey there, and welcome to Work Dope, a podcast on the messiness and the potential of humans at work. I'm Linda Stacy, and I'm a corporate sellout and a corporate innovator. And I like to think that working in corporate America doesn't have to suck, even though, even as Adam Grant says, it often does. By some stats, up to 80% of the workforce are unsatisfied at work. And on the flip side, the paradox here is that folks are expecting more and more to create meaning and purpose. They're basing their identity around their roles in the workplace. In today's climate, we can't help but look at what quality of life looks like and what culture really means for people inside of organizations. I do think that businesses and organizational life can be cool. I think that building things and solving real world problems, that's the nature of business at its heart. These are all fundamental to the best parts of what humans can bring to our experience here on the planet. It's how we embrace human potential. WorkDope is on a mission to reinvent the work experience and is committed to bringing insights, tools, and inspiration into employees at all levels in an organization. Most importantly, to the individual contributors, the people who are really keeping those wheels from falling off the bus day to day. A couple of intro notes around this episode. I am talking about distraction, but really the flip side of that, attention, where and how we are focusing our attention. But I like to start from this viewpoint of distraction and interruption because I think a lot of people can identify with this at work and acknowledge that some of it is self-induced distraction, interruption, and some of it is external, and it can really just cause this root place of frustration. One of the things I'm going to talk about in this episode is why do we endeavor to learn anything or seek to understand anything? Why do we listen to podcasts? I'm going to go over this pyramid of whys that I came up with, pyramid of WHY. S, like whys, like why do we look at things like this? So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but ultimately this theme is leading us also towards just fundamentals around Work Dope, improving and bettering the quality of your experience within the day-to-day, your experience and my experience to be sure. So I'm going to be talking about human evolution, where this all started, our biology, our history. I'll go over the pyramid of whys. Also, the things that we do to ourselves and how other people are complicit and how to deal with other people causing interruptions and distraction. And of course, how we can mitigate from mindset to specific how-tos. And a couple of housekeeping reminders. As I mentioned last time, I'll be going 10 episodes straight. So from when this recent series started consistently, that would bring us through to March 2nd. Then I'll take 3 weeks off. Or there will be 3 weeks of no podcast. It doesn't mean that I'm taking 3 weeks away from it necessarily. So they're dropping on Thursdays. So keep that in mind. And LinkedIn Live. I'm going to be doing a LinkedIn Live sometime in the March-April timeframe, all on the topic of values, both, what are our values, but also how are we valued inside of an organization? This question I've been asking all of my guests that have come on the show. So keep your eye out for that. It will be on LinkedIn Live, more webinar style, and of course, probably uploaded on this space as well. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hey there. So 2 things that I wanted to say before we get into the topic of distraction, interruption, attention, and attention loss, attention span. The first one is I seem to be conditioned that I'm supposed to have everything tied up neatly in a bow at the end of something that I put out into the world. I think this comes directly from the work world. The bottom line is that neat bows just don't coincide with these topics because anything that has to do with humans doesn't seem to be tied up neatly with bows. I just think that also in the speaking world, I kind of got the idea that if a speech wasn't really well tied up, that was just unfair to audiences. And I do think that that's true to some extent. But I think that the outlining and the nature of podcasts is a little bit different because of the flow of them. But anyway, hope I don't keep people hanging. I'm trying to get over it in this episode. Sometimes I feel like I'm contradicting myself within like the very episode as I listen back to it. Again, imperfection everywhere. I actually think that there's some beauty and freedom in just recognizing this and observing it and being okay with it. The bottom line is I'd say that a lot of these things that I'm talking about, none of it is black and white. Everything is on a spectrum. Sometimes we are doing a million things and that's okay. And sometimes we need to take a break and that's okay. And it's all kind of part of this these contrasting aspects that make life really, really cool. Definitely interesting to consider these things here as it has to do with your quality of life at work and the rest of the world. So that's a little something that I just felt like I had to say. The second thing is I happened to listen to Tim Ferriss and Seinfeld interview. Tim Ferriss has a podcast. He's really fantastic. I don't know if you are familiar with him already, but he is someone who interviews people who have done significant things. And then his tack is to understand what structure, systems, frameworks got them there. Of course, he asks them really interesting questions about their life and their work. To some extent, this too is the premise of Work Dope, to create like structures for people in corporate environments in order to excel, to do things, to be significant, and to be significant in the ways that mean significance for the individual, so that doesn't necessarily mean climbing the corporate ladder or doing the things that everyone thinks equals success, but, how do people thrive in whatever way makes sense for them? So the things that I really liked about listening to the Seinfeld episode that I just wanted to share, Seinfeld is extremely disciplined. Some of you might know that already. Another thing that I'm always listening for, and I think is interesting, he tends to lean towards depressive, and I would say that is true for me too. I also know, Lincoln, there's a book called Lincoln's Melancholy. A lot of people who have done significant things in their lives happen to also have some melancholy or depression or whatever you want to call that. And Seinfeld shares that he read once that depression or leaning this way is part of the package for creative. And he has found solace in that. And I have too. And maybe you resonate with this as well. Seinfeld described himself in the episode as being sensitive. And he said, that just makes it really easy to irritate me. He's very easily irritated. He actually talked about like physically being irritated, but also he just notices things that maybe other people don't notice. And of course, this is the source for his comedy, right? And I parallel this, of course, to my irritations with the world of work. They won't quit. I can't help but notice things at work. So I have this itch that I cannot stop scratching. And Work Dope and these types of platforms allow me to kind of get it out and develop and to help other people and to develop myself at the same time. Another thing, this theme comes through again and again. Exercise is the most significant antidote to depression. And my morning walks are like an elixir for me. He strongly states that a pair of running shoes over pharmaceutical antidepressants would do the world, so much good for so many. Of course, Ferriss kind of says, well, maybe exercise and antidepressants. I don't think he doesn't want to throw people under the bus or whatever, but Jerry really has some reactions to this. I look him up. I mean, maybe you'll like Tim Ferriss. I think some people have a negative reaction to him. I think he's fantastic, but look it up. I thought it was a very funny and real and transparent interaction, and it speaks to, the risk that people take when they do meaningful things in the world and the structure that it takes to get there. Hey, so we're going to talk about distraction, and I'm going to debunk a bunch of things, and I want to talk about why distraction really isn't always bad, and maybe that's one of the problems with it, that we put all of this negative energy on it and feel bad about ourselves because we get distracted. But I have to say it can get in the way if we don't mitigate. So we need some skills, right? I'm going to put this in the same premise that I used when I gave the distraction speech to Applied Materials last year. And when I say speech, it was like a 1 hour, 15 minutes kind of interactive presentation around some of these ideas. And what I was describing to them, I feel like there's these different layers of why anyone exposes themselves to new information, a presentation at work, reading a book, whatever. At some level, there's just building awareness, right? And in this case, we're learning more about our biology and the history of, human evolution and why we get distracted, like how it is and why it is built into our biology. Really also paying attention to what we're allowing, and then also how we react to the various things, whether or not we're allowing them in or we're having them encroach on our space or whatever, having them. People come in and distract us and such. We didn't necessarily ask for it. Of course, there's always the point around tactics, some strategies, some things to actually implement in order to preserve and conserve energy if distraction and interruption is kind of zapping you. Having a mindset shift, I think, is even at a higher level if we can really begin to just think differently about the nature of distraction. And again, not be so hard on ourselves about it. So much in society, we're so hard on ourselves for the fact that we only have 44 seconds of attention span, which I would really challenge. There's been a lot of research around these things, and I feel like we're getting freaked out by some things that that maybe we're just being a little bit too harsh. We have to acknowledge that we're still getting a shit ton of stuff done in society and in the economy and everything else, despite all of this, reduced attention span. Yes, of course, I would love it if everyone could be more into critical thinking and deeply reflecting on things. And maybe that's not happening as much, but who knew how much that was happening in the population before? Anyway, the fourth pyramid of whys concept that really what I think is the best part of any type of learning or development is the growth potential. And really, when I say growth, I mean changing in some level, whether it's personal, professional, organizational. And really, in my experience, if a human begins to change in any aspect of their life, it begins to trickle into other aspects of their life. My own experience, I think some people know this, kind of was a confluence, couple of things. I happened to join Weight Watchers in 2012, and it was the same year that my husband and I combined finances. These are very random things. This was not done on purpose or anything. It was just kind of like, I noticed that my weight was getting more out of control, and I thought, I'm going to try this Weight Watchers thing. And so I started doing that. And husband and I were going to combine finances. I was very insecure about that. And I knew about Dave Ramsey's program, and he wanted to, I didn't. So I said, if we're going to do this, we're going to follow this program. And it was kind of like, a bit of leverage for me to understand that we would be approaching it with a similar viewpoint. Anyway, those two things came together at a time, and I began to see how structure and forethought and deciding what you want can really impact your entire life. And so we get into that. And distraction is part of what we're trying to build structure around and for. But anyway, so much here. Going over to biology and our evolution, if you do a little bit, not even a lot, of research on this, we are programmed as human beings to be hyper alert. It was for our survival. When we were in a type of environment where animals could hunt us and we were out hunting for our own food, we had to be very, very alert and aware of our surroundings at all times. So it behooved us to be aware and pay attention and to kind of have spidey senses. These were superpowers. These are the things that made it through as far as evolutionary development. Today, we are so concerned about technology and our waning attention spans, and I think we don't often acknowledge our history here. There was a time, too, when Socrates was very concerned about people learning to read. There was concern around the printing press because this was going to make it easier for the written word to get around, that people weren't going to have to rely on their memories, and this was going to reduce their ability to concentrate and focus. And all of these things have only advanced us in society. I also found when I was doing research on this, an image, it was kind of funny. It was from the early 1900s of a business person, I think, with this like contraption on his head. I wish I could have the picture in a podcast. It was just hilarious. This big, huge contraption that he would kind of put on his head so that nothing in his environment would distract him. And this at a time where maybe they didn't have phones, so we as humans are quite distracted. And I'm always giving people the Pomodoro method as a way to kind of stay focused and on task, where people set a kitchen timer or some kind of timer every 25 minutes. And that name was given to that technique in the 80s, a time before all of these alerts and social media. And so this college kid who was trying to study would set his timer in 25-minute increments just to stay hyper-focused. And it was just like the timer was like a reminder to him to stay on what you're doing. Side point here, my sister, I was helping at one point, and I was telling her to, use the Pomodoro method, set your timer. And she'd laugh at herself. She said after 8 minutes, she was completely on to 8 other things. Her timer would go off and she'd be like, what? Like 15 things had happened in that 25-minute period. She gets a ton done. She gets very hard on herself. But again, this is kind of like, use the tools to the extent that you can. And at the end of the day, we are wired for this shit. There's another note in literature and, science about distraction and daydreaming and how these are really important for us. Bill Gates actually schedules total downtime annually for himself. Maya Angelou, when she would go away for writing weekends or, times where she would really dedicate to writing, she would bring crossword puzzles. And there was something about this mildly active work that would kind of get her other thoughts going. And I know for me too, there are certain things I can do to kind of get my creative juices flowing, and they're not usually being focused on text or something like that. I even give a story once that I was working on this very short speech I was preparing, and it just was not coming together. I was just having the hardest time. And I decided to go do dishes. It was like, I may as well get something done. And a lot of things started coming together for me while I was doing dishes. And then later I saw something said by a scientist about various ways that our brain works. There's this task positive mode and there's this default mode network. And task positive is used when we're learning, we're building new neural pathways, and it's very, very energy heavy. And we need breaks from this type of learning. But then when we're doing things that are more rote or things that our bodies already know how to do, like if we're taking a jog or we're doing dishes or these types of things, it kind of gives us an opportunity. The brand new neural pathways begin to make connections to stored memories. And that's when those connections come, the eurekas, the aha moments. So downtime is super important. Now, I don't have aha moments as much when I'm watching TV, unless I'm watching something mildly inspirational or a movie that's kind of got some deep meaning or something like that. So if you want those moments, it's almost like you have to create the distracted or the other times. Almost every day, if I'm intentional about it, something can occur to me while I'm taking a walk that likely wouldn't have occurred to me in other places. In fact, launching this podcast and kind of letting Living Blueprints go, at least for a period of time, was something that occurred to me very, very strongly during a walk. There's a lot of evidence of people in history who have experienced eurekas, ahas, all of these things while they're doing things that are seemingly wasteful when it comes to the expenditure of time. So the idea to do this episode, and it had been on my mind before, again, because I did a couple presentations focused on distraction in the last year. But in my research on distraction in the workplace, UC Irvine came up in it, and they had done some studies in the 80s and 90s around how often we're distracted at work. So those were some of the main numbers that I was able to work from when I was doing that presentation. And then I heard on my most favorite podcast, Dax Shepard and Monica Padman on Armchair Expert, had Gloria Mark on, and she is at UC Irvine. And so she is connected to that original study, or the other study that I was looking at. And she has a book coming out next year called Attention Span, actually this year now, Attention Span, a groundbreaking way to restore balance, happiness, and productivity. She works in the Department of Informatics, which she described as the intersection of people and technology. So some of the concepts here are further discussion from her book and what she talked about on the podcast. And just, I thought I would use some of this for a little bit of context, but she talks about flow. Flow is this concept, and Csikszentmihalyi, this gentleman who wrote the book Flow, and talks about these activities where we totally lose track of time, right? And how awesome that is. It's like nirvana in some ways, and it's different things for different people. I know for my husband, it's fishing. It's absolutely not fishing for me. For me, it tends to be things that I'm doing with my hands, or back in the day, I found out that scrapbooking did that for me. I felt like such a loser for being into that type of activity, but it was wild how it took me away. Sewing, I have to be less judgmental on myself. These things that I shamed other people for. Now I have the self-shame around some of these activities, but just really things where 4 hours went by and you had no idea. Gambling falls into this. So flow is not like this rosy thing that has always got a positive outcome. People can get lost in here, and they can lose aspects of their lives. They can lose connection. And Csikszentmihalyi talks about this in his work. So Gloria talks about it too. And she talks about work. A lot of her book is focused around work, our work lives. And there's some who feel like we should be able to have more flow in our day jobs. And Gloria talks about the fact that she used to be an artist. She was an artist before she was an analyst in this educational capacity. And she's like, I experienced a ton of flow when I was an artist. She's like, I turn on music, I would just do my thing. And she doesn't as much when she's doing the type of work she does now. She says she gets into it sometimes, depending, certain types of analysis will kind of get her there. And I thought it was so great to hear someone say that, like, it's okay if we don't feel flow. Like, I feel it for little bits and spurts in my day job. If I'm designing a training program or, I can really kind of flesh something out, that feels like flow. A lot of times it has to do with the materials I'm using. So if I'm fleshing something out in a Word document or trying to do it in PowerPoint versus if I have a piece of flip chart paper or a whiteboard and different colored markers, totally different experience. Like me just feeling like I can be creative and I can just put thoughts, upper left and that seems to mean something, and lower in the middle in green and that seems to mean something else. Like that my brain just kind of works better that way than if I have to do it all linearly in like a Word doc or figure out the creation in PowerPoint as I go. So there are aspects of it in most knowledge work jobs, but it's not what anyone could expect to be doing 24/7. I felt like this was kind of nice. It was kind of like permission to kind of let it go a little bit and relax. One thing I do know is that a lot of elements around this podcast do bring me flow. So it's like, I feel like I have to keep doing it. You have to have these things in your life. You have to create the time and space for things like flow. So flow was part of what she was debunking in her book in terms of what successful or satisfying or fulfilling work can look like. You can have fulfilling work without flow being there. And then, of course, there are these ideas around multitasking and myths around multitasking. I think most of us know that it's impossible to really be doing two things that require cognitive attention at the same time. It's very possible for us to drive and eat, drive and talk on the phone, drive and listen to music, but it wouldn't be so easy to drive and do those other things if you were first learning it. I mean, think about how much energy it takes for a child to learn how to walk and how focused they are on that. And then later in life, it really is second nature on all the other things that we do while we're walking. So there is this idea that we can do two things simultaneously, and if they're cognitively engaging, you're not going to be. And I think a classic example of this is if you're on a conference call and you glance over an email and you read that subject line, you begin to get pulled in. You really are no longer listening to what is happening in that meeting. You might be able to switch super, super fast, and kudos to you, I think. I don't know if that's a super skill. I think that ultimately you might be draining your energy even more. I don't think it's cool for the other people in the meeting if that's happening all the time. I mean, I know I'm guilty of it, but I know also that it's not cool. I try to give myself the gift of only paying attention to one thing at a time, but really, you're not really doing two things at once. There's a distinction here, though. You could have something in the works on one end. You can have like 3 simultaneous tasks that you're working on during a day. Like you're waiting to hear back from someone, so you move on to something else. That's quite different. But I will suggest that anytime you are working on something, even if you're typing an email, finish the paragraph, finish the thought, finish the whatever until you let yourself be distracted by a pop-up, a new email, a text, even a phone call. If you can let the phone kind of ring a few times, although that's not happening as much in our modern work life. There are times when I've had a person approach me and I'm in the middle of completing a thought, and I will actually hold up a finger or give them a look like, give me, 2 seconds or whatever. I really have a hard time with people just kind of walking up and expecting that you're going to be ready to talk to them if it's in the middle of a work day. At least wait for them to turn or pause or something, and make sure they can see you, of course. I've had people standing right in front of me, and because I'm looking down at my machine, I'm not aware of the fact that they're standing there. So a couple of stats around how often we get distracted at work. It really is pretty high. I think more the issue here is how long it takes for us to re-engage. So when we get distracted, on average, according to Gloria Mark's work, it's 25 minutes before we're fully re-engaged in the work. I have a lot of experience with this. I don't know that this is really true. I don't know that she's really looking at all of the various kinds of work that people can be doing. They've also done research to say, so what's the average screen duration? In 2004, you were on the same screen for 2.5 minutes. They're saying now, in like 2019, the average is 47 seconds per screen. So that means, you're staying in one application or one browser page, and then you're flipping to another one about every 47 seconds. So this research is showing us that we interrupt ourselves almost as much as we get interrupted from the outside, or that in the absence of external distractions, we will create them ourselves with almost the same frequency. So what do we need to understand, and how can we mitigate? I talked before about mindset, and I do think this is really big, because if we're just getting mad at ourselves or at situations that are not going to change, that really isn't helping anything. A quick note on the impact of others, right? Others in our environment, whether we're at home or at work. It's so easy to get really ticked off because really the very nature of our roles, implicit within them, is that we're going to get distracted. And I know for a long time, because it's been such a big part of the role that I've played in my professional life, I had to take a mindset shift at some point. Definitely in my role, and I'm certain in almost every role in an organization, part of your work is helping or allowing other people do their work. At some point, we need information from others. They need, vice versa, goes back and forth, and we're relying on each other to get things done, right? It's the nature of teams and teamwork. It's very rare that we can have a completely autonomous role. So we can get pissed at how we're being called upon to do things, and certainly some people approach us better, right? Sometimes you get an email where it's really, really clear what someone needs from us and why they want it. The context is there and it's helpful for us to jump right in. And other times we really kind of have to distill, what is it they're asking? What is it they need? What is my part in this? And that's not to say that there's really anything wrong with the asker, although sometimes we put it in that lens. Sometimes the asker doesn't have all the right context or background. There's just so much involved here. And really these stories that we tell ourselves in frustration can add to the drag in this entire situation. At the end of the day, working with others, playing well with others, as they say when we were little, it's foundational for success, really, even when those others are difficult. And of course, we don't want to be the difficult one, right? How could we lay out our email in a way that's helpful, but that we're not overtaxing ourselves or being people pleasers either? But going back to this idea of interrupting ourselves or being interrupted, every time this happens, our inner whiteboard of something that we might have been working on or thinking about is erased. I've heard that analogy before. It goes back to my note around getting an entire thought out, writing out that paragraph. Even if you yourself are compelled to look at something else, get that thought or that thing that's going kind of taken to the full end, or make a quick note. If you are going to have to be interrupted, get pulled into a conversation, can you make a note of where you are leaving off so that you can jump back in a little bit more easily? And, some thoughts around staying more focused and on task and limiting the potential for yourself to be disrupted by yourself in some ways. And this really is going to seem basic to people who are quote unquote super organized. And if you are one of these people, you just need to know that not everyone comes naturally with this inner organized system. And I'm not even sure that it's really natural for anyone. I'm pretty sure that these are conditioned behaviors, modeled behaviors. People are super organized in reaction to something else. I know a lot of people who are organizers or do that as a really firm part of what their work life is. And it's in a direct response to how they grew up in chaos or something like that. So these are not automatic skills for anyone. And I feel really defensive about this because I was actually challenged once. Well, it's not the only reason I feel defensive, but I was challenged once by an audience member when I was speaking to a group, an IEEE group, which is a big engineering association. And a female engineer challenged the thought that a scientist should be disciplined and should be able to stay focused. And I know for a fact that you can have a scientific seat and have a terrible time with focus. There are people with ADHD who end up in really fine positions and they have learned ways to discipline themselves, right? There were examples in that very audience. One professor was offering that he procrastinated terribly when it came around to writing proposals. There was a graduate student who approached me afterwards who was telling me he didn't know how to mitigate his environment. He had a lot of other students in a lab, and it just was very, very hard to focus. And, how does he work inside that environment? So you might feel like these are automatic things that people know how to do or should know how to do, and it's not automatic, right? These things, I think, it's helpful for people to learn ways to do their work better. I also feel like having a little bit of discipline around things never really hurts you. I actually think it can provide more access for a creative process if you've kind of gotten some frameworks together in advance. How we organize a project at work from the outside can really impact how well we orchestrate overall. And I think you do best to map out steps. And I am the worst at this. I am someone who just wants to jump right in, just start putting things together. I use cooking as an analogy, or baking is what I really prefer to do. And I just want to start mixing. I want to start concocting. I don't want to have to gather all the ingredients. I don't want to read through the recipe, all of those things. But whenever I do, I'm in a much better state. And it's the same with work. If I can kind of jot through a process, if I'm working on a project, and gather my materials before I get started, I'm much less likely to get distracted. I find that I get distracted. I know this is true for other people when I have to start hunting around my machine for other materials. Like if I have to go and find some reference material or an email or a list or whatever the various ingredients are, if you will, for me to put that project and get it going, I'm much better off if I kind of think of it in advance and gather those materials, if you will, open them up, have them ready to go on my machine. Of course, closing out of windows can help a lot too, so that you're not tempted or as tempted to click into email or social media. I find too that if I do this pre-work, there's a much better chance that I will maybe have a little moment of flow while I'm doing the activity. That's never a bad thing. Doing this type of thing can also make it much easier to pick up the task. Like I said before, you're going to have to, even if you're not interrupted or distracted by something, you're going to have to put projects down. We often have to block time. We might be able to only work on something for 25 minutes, pushing it forward. So you could do this kind of process where you're laying something out, a project out, kind of the rough steps, because you might not know every step that you're going to be carrying through as you go, but do it at the beginning of the week. And then when you have these little pieces of time in between, you're kind of working on it, moving it forward throughout the course of the week, and you're not stressing yourself up, wondering where you left off and all the rest. Huge premise here with Work Dope is believing that doing good work without too much suffering and with as much sense of ease or feeling a success as possible, that's what we're going for. So how can you set yourself up? This isn't about, the environment being shitty. This is about how you can really set yourself up to be the best, to do the best within the given environment. Some of what I'm talking about here too ties into the premise from the last episode 22, where I was talking about these stages of the career. And one of them was the super doer. And I was suggesting that these days, especially with individual contributors, if you're in that kind of role for your entire career, you may end up just being tired and burnt out because you never leave the super doer state. You're constantly working through tasks and expediting and never really having the opportunity to be strategic or to be a coach, mentor. Many of us have a ton on our plates, and sometimes executives or our bosses or leaders don't have any concept of what you are trying to manage day to day, all of the different moving pieces that we're trying to manage. It's just not understood by all. In my role, and I'm sure in yours too, there's various requests that you're given or projects that you're working on. You've got these Teams or Slack conversations going. You've got to manage the email correspondence, understanding what's relevant for you to respond to, understand what's relevant for you to kind of wrap your head around if it's reference material. It's just a lot to stay on top of in ways that, and how do you do that without it being so draining, without it being a real lag on yourself? How do you fill your cup at the end of the day? I was at a networking event years ago, and I was using the event kind of creatively. I was going to everything at the time, just talking to whoever I could to get perspectives. And there were some people from executive level who were there in different capacities. One had recently left an executive position and was starting his own business. And actually, that was the case for another one that I spoke to as well. And I brought up what I was doing in terms of teaching productivity, because that's really what I was focused on at the time, and just trying to get their perspectives around what they thought about productivity in the workplace and what they thought about the ability of their teams to get things done. And they were really quite separate from these issues. And I thought this was interesting. Like, I really felt like, my entire life is filled with, trying to move things forward and getting things done efficiently. And it really didn't seem like it was something that they were concerned about at all in terms of the people that they were managing and leading. One of them was saying that, it's a hiring issue and that they have to trust that they're hiring the right people. And I understand this. We definitely have to hire well. But when we think of people in the early stages of their career and it's the first time they're being hired, do they really understand and get the dynamics of workplace, all the things coming in and out, all the different communication channels, how to navigate all of this? There is a need to upskill at some level, and who takes on that responsibility within the organization? Do we just have to hope that that young new individual contributor gets lucky and has the right boss or the right peer showing them how to manage all of these things? There's a good potential that these people are going to miss, that they're not going to get that type of exposure to these types of skills. So I get that, yes, we need to be sure we're hiring the right people, but we also need to be sure that we have kind of that wet cement theory or perspective where we're really upskilling in ways that work well, that are considering the human being and making sure that they're able to organize their projects and be successful and feel successful. Another one that I spoke to that day was kind of laughing at the idea that I didn't have the luxury to work like 2 consecutive hours on one project. I don't know what exactly I was describing to them, but I remember just saying that, I've had to get very creative about writing a book or working on major workshops because I didn't have really large chunks of time to work on them. And this is the nature of work for a lot of people today, that they don't have the luxury of these major pieces of time. He just totally didn't understand what that might be like. The awareness around burnout in the workplace is getting more and more attention, which I think is good. I believe that individuals need to be better at managing their own burnout potential. We need to work on mindset. We need to work on approach. These are ways to get better. But another way to elevate above or away from the super doer, this was the second stage of the 4 stages, I believe moving into the next 2 kind of on your own without being given the role necessarily. Move into mentor coach. How do you mentor coach yourself? How do you mentor coach someone else? You might have peers that could use, your vision, a kind of a gentle touch, help people do things better. But really, even taking that approach for yourself, how can I do this better? How can I not have such a drag when I'm working with specific things? I also think it could be really cool to be your own visionary, your own strategist. So if you've got a day that's just jam-packed of a lot of activity, a lot of moving things around, moving things forward, can you ever take that 20 or 30,000 foot view at everything that you're doing, do a little bit of planning, have some sense of how what you're doing ties into the strategic outlook for the entire company, and really how your actions are advancing the organization in a broader way? I also think it's really important to know what and how you contribute to the work matters. It's important that you know what you're contributing matters and how you're contributing it matters. How you contribute is very linked to your values. Are you considering human beings on both sides or all sides of the equation? Are you being curious and open? And all of the other things we've talked about in the podcast about what exemplify leadership qualities. Going back to values, are you operating from your values? Again, this is something that we're going to be talking more about in coming weeks, especially as I get closer to doing my LinkedIn Live on this concept. Plus, it's been this question I've been asking all of my guests. How do you know that you're being seen and valued inside of the workplace? Are you working towards being seen the way that you want to be seen? Promotion and advancement come from really espousing the traits that hiring managers are looking for. Colleen, who I spoke to in a prior episode, was saying how hiring managers are looking for leadership skills in people who are not yet leaders, right? When they're looking to promote into leadership positions, they're looking for leadership skills. But really what they're hoping to see is that the person is already demonstrating the leadership skills when they're being considered for advancement or for hire. So moving into these other levels of mentor coach, whether it's yourself or mentor coaching peers, people who have come in under you, and also having a more strategic viewpoint or framework when you're sitting in meetings, when you're contributing in meetings, when you're thinking about your own work. All of these things will increase your potential for advancement, both personally and how you feel about your work, but potentially actually giving you the opportunity to advance in your role. More than anything, I really think we want a net positive at the end of the day, and that we need to be looking at ways to get ourselves there. So how can we cognitively replenish? How can we be sure that we're not completely draining ourselves? We need to take strategic breaks. I don't really like using the word strategic with a break, but there are activities that will drain you in ways that are not helpful to get you back on track for work. So do things that maybe uplift you when you move away from your computer. Can you go for a short walk? Can you do something that's helping you with some aspect of your life but it's completely different? When you're working from home, I'd say some small household thing that you can move forward that actually uses a part of your body. You will feel differently when you come back to your work. A couple of other things to think about. One is Parkinson's law, and that is this idea where we take up the amount of time that we're given to do something. It's also a physical thing. If I'm given space to work on a project, on a surface, on a table, on a counter, I will fill that entire space with all of my things. But if I'm only able to work in a confined area, I seem to do fine also. But this can happen with tasks. And sometimes if we have too much time to do something, we might let it drag on and on forever. So one idea that was brought up by Gloria, the person I was referring to earlier, who has written the book Attention, is really to do your best to work in focused spurts and high intensity and get that rough draft done in 35 minutes instead of saying, well, you've got 4 hours, do 4 hours. Of course, I don't think any of us really have 4 hours. But if we do have, a long lead time, it's still good to compress it and get as much out in short periods as you can. This is another great time to use the Pomodoro method to just set a timer for 25 minutes and focus all of your attention on that very one thing, especially something that is project oriented. A few other things in terms of goals to set for ourselves when it comes to our attention and not being so drained. They talked a lot about reframing, which is what I'm talking about when I'm saying shifting our mindset around what it means to be distracted, what it means to be interrupted. Also reframing our ideas around being productive, like the most highest productivity that we could possibly get out, and more about looking for well-being and some kind of psychological homeostasis. I feel like these things go hand in hand though. And when you really do work on making yourself more whole and you're working from self-leadership concepts, you end up having more capacity to get more things done and more of the right things done. You might even have new perspectives such that you're prioritizing in different ways, and that's making your work more meaningful and more obvious to other people in the organization. I haven't said it yet in this episode, but really what we're trying to avoid is being in a constant state of fight or flight, because it's just terrible for our entire biological system, cortisol and adrenaline keeping us going. It's really not going to help us be in the net positive at the end of the day. So we're looking for ways to calm and to replenish. They mentioned taking a walk. That is one of the most ideal ways. A second way that you could is to do small bits of meditation. It doesn't even have to be a long time. It could be a 6 to 9 minute meditation, a 10, a 12, a 20 minute is awesome. The days that I'm able to do that, I really feel like I've taken a nap and I feel like I've come back a completely different person. And usually if I'm cognizant and I'm staying aware, I'm doing that at the time when I'm most drawn to go grab a cookie or something else that's stimulating and that would distract me in ways that are not ideal, because they might give me a short burst, but I will have that slump afterwards. After the insulin response thing is all finished its cycle, I'll feel worse than I did when I started. And you become more and more addicted to that, and you become more and more reliant on having that caloric burst in the afternoon, and that's something I personally want to avoid. In general, observing when and how your mind wanders can be helpful. Trying to stay in the present will reduce some of the anxiety that can come when we're thinking about the future, when we're thinking about the past. We can get very, very anxious in those times when we're overthinking things. So the more that we can stay in the present and moving things forward, the more we're going to keep ourselves in solid psychological homeostasis. Wrapping things up on this particular episode, even though referencing the intro, my wrapping is messy and there are no bows. At the beginning, we referenced Jerry Seinfeld and Tim Ferriss. Again, a quick Google search should help you to find Tim Ferriss's podcast. It was done at the beginning of 2020, but again, I was able to find it pretty quickly by just searching within my Spotify app for Seinfeld and Tim Ferriss. We talked about distraction and the pyramid of whys, why engage in any new thing, any new learning. We talked about how modifications in any one area of life tend to bleed into other areas of life. And I have found that when something's really meeting a need, a pain point, it's going to stick a little bit better. We talked about our human biology, evolution, and history as it relates to this tendency towards distraction. We talked about daydreaming and lack of focus and how those are also part of the puzzle, the big picture, especially when it comes to creativity. We mentioned some statistic and research around distraction and interruption at work. We also kind of related this to the topic of flow because that does come up in this broader context. We talked about multitasking and several tips to help manage all the things, but managing those things with a sense of full-throttled, high quality of experience, even though it's often messy. I hope you enjoyed this episode. There you have it. Episode 23 is in the books. If you find this content useful, I would love it if you would subscribe on whatever platform you're using, Spotify, iTunes, etc. And of course, I'd love a comment. This is because the more listener activity a show has, the higher the chances that other folks who would potentially enjoy similar content, they'll actually be able to find it. It'll rise up through the ranking system and the algorithm, at least based on certain search terms. As always, I hope you are doing well in your work and in your life, seeking to up-level the experience for humans in your environment by shoring yourself up and living your values within integrity, even when things feel like a shit show. As always, please send any comments or messages my way. You can send a note or a recorded message to linda@workdopepod.com. That's linda@workdopepod.com. Until next time, this is Linda Stacy signing off for Work Dope. Bye-bye.